Okay, so we're going to continue talking about community ecology here. If you remember in the previous lecture within this chunk, we were talking about different, I guess you could call them relationships or different types of interactions within the community. We were discussing predator-prey, obviously a very significant one because that exists in every community. And then we're talking about prey defense mechanisms, how prey have evolved ways to stay alive. Again, think about it. If your prey all gets killed, your predator population starves to death. So it makes sense that those defense systems would be there to keep some of the prey alive. And that's where natural selection becomes a very, very important concept to remember. The strongest prey survive, the weakest predators die. The strongest predators survive, the weakest prey die. So natural selection has helped shape a lot of these different types of interactions we see within communities. And then we were talking about parasitism. Definitely go back through all of the different groups we've discussed, the different kingdoms and some of those phyla, and think about what is their lifestyle. How many of those things are parasites? We talked about different bacterial parasites, different fungal, different protists, different animals. There's lots and lots of examples. But the key with parasites, they're not trying to kill the host. They just use the host to gain energy and a place to reproduce. But a parasite doesn't want to kill you because then it has to find a new host. And that's not a good thing for a parasite. So, okay, we left off with brood parasitism, and as I mentioned, the key in this is if you are the parasite, you can't use the same species to raise your young, generation after generation after generation after generation, because eventually there won't be any of those hosts left. So you have to bounce around in species. You're using species B this year, and then species C this year, and then species D this year, maybe back to B, but you can't over-parasitize, or it leads to problems with the population size of your host, which then causes a problem with you. So, okay, other relationship to mention is commensalism. Now, this is kind of a goofy one. Let me put out the basic definition. In commensalism. So with commensalism, the way it's viewed as one species gains and there is no impact on the other species. So there's no positive gain or loss to the other species. It really doesn't matter if you're there. So again, I want you guys to think of examples. Think about the lichen. Would a lichen be considered commensalistic? Which species gains? Which one has no impact? So the classical example is the clownfish and the anemone. So we've talked about anemones. Think about phylum Nadaria. They have little stinging cells shooting out to little harpoons. And then the clownfish. Talked about bony fish. Well, the clownfish lives in the tentacles of the anemone. The anemone doesn't kill it. It just says, whatever, you can live there. The clownfish has a shelter and a place to live, place to reproduce, protection. What's the anemone gain? Is the anemone actually getting anything beneficial from this relationship? If the clownfish were to leave, would the anemone suffer? If there is no impact, positive or negative, to the anemone by having a clownfish there, then we would consider it a commensalistic relationship or commensalism. These are probably the hardest ones to find in nature, just because as you study them more and you look at the interactions more, a lot of these behaviors or relationships begin to change over the course of time, generations. The interactions start to change, and sometimes they move away from commensalism and they move into what we call mutualism. Oh, got a bad typo, sorry. Okay, so with mutualism, both species are going to benefit from the relationship. There's a positive gain for both of you here. So you want to maintain and foster this relationship. The concern with mutualism, put a little asterisk, oh, let me move that down below, sorry. So the concern of commensalism is if your survival is dependent upon the other species, that can be a bad thing. So here's the example. We see this in the Southwest United States, Central America, Africa, etc. This plant is known as the bullhorn acacia. So it's a herbaceous plant. It will live 10, 15 years, whatever. Photosynthesizer, producer, so there's a stem. But the characteristic thing about the acacia are these thorns. And the thorns look like the horns of a bull, why they call certain varieties bullhorn acacia. Inside the thorns here are little houses, and you have little ants living inside of there. So now the ants have a place to live, they have a place to raise their young, they have basically an apartment. There's actually a hole on the bottom of the thorn here. It's hollow. And the ants crawl into the thorn, do their thing inside. And it's hard to see, but right over here, these little circles, these are called extrafloral nectarines. They're little protein packets. So you're an ant colony living on an acacia. You have food and a place to live. Fantastic. It's everything you need for you to survive as a population. The acacia now has a built-in defense mechanism. If something comes to eat the acacia, grasshopper, different species of birds, maybe a rabbit or whatever the case may be, the ants go out and attack. So if you grab an acacia and you shake it, if it has an ant colony associated with it, you'll have hundreds of ants swarming you almost instantly, biting and stinging and attacking, trying to defend their plant. So great relationship. They both benefit. I have protection, you have a place to live. The problem is if we were to remove the ants, the acacia has no other defense system. It doesn't produce toxins, it doesn't produce thorns that sting or anything like that. So it's very susceptible to predators. Remove the ants, acacia usually gets eaten pretty quickly. If you remove the acacia, well, then the ants are out of luck. They're like, hey, we got no place to live. Where do we go? What do we do? They're going to be dead as well. So mutualism can be a very, very positive relationship, but it can be tricky if your survival is dependent. You become mutually exclusive and you cannot survive with anybody else. That becomes a very, very serious concern. So, okay, one last relationship we see. Example of a relationship we see in communities is a thing known as cleaning symbiosis. Now you'll hear the term sorry, let me move my picture. Symbiosis is just species working together. That's what, when we say symbiosis, that's what it is. Two species working together. Cleaning symbiosis is a specific example or specific type of symbiosis. It's where one species acts as a cleaner. Now, the image is tough to see. Let me zoom in, see if I can give you a better view here. All right, there we go. See that little fish on top of the head of the big fish? Ooh, too big. Okay, so this little fish right here. Uh-oh, right there. That tiny little thin fish is known as a neon goby. That fish lives on this coral. So we talked about corals, cnidarians, anthozoans. So the fish lives on the coral here. This is the cleaning station. It's the car wash, the dentist's office, whatever you want to call it. When the big fish comes over, it actually does specific behaviors to tell the cleaner, hey, can you pick parasites off my forehead? I got something stuck up here and I can't get it off. And the cleaner will come out, eat the parasites, clean the fish, the big fish. And the big fish here is called a parrotfish. And then the big fish is happy, great, I'm clean, I'm healthy. The cleaner, hey, I got a free, easy meal. They both benefit, but it's a very, very specific type of relationship. So consider the evolution of this behavior and this relationship. The cleaner has to trust the big fish that it's not going to eat it. The big fish has to trust the cleaner that it's not going to attack it and parasitize it. So this is a behavior and a relationship that's evolved between two species over the course of thousands of generations to benefit both. Now, if you go rogue as the parrotfish and you decide, I'm going to eat that little guy, great, you got a meal today. But if you lose your cleaner, what's that going to do long term to you with your health and your population? So think about it the next time you go to the dentist. If you were to eat your dentist, well, great, you got a meal, but are you ever going to get your teeth cleaned again? And as a consumer, an herbivore, an omnivore, or carnivore, whatever type of consumer you are, if you don't have good teeth and a good way to feed yourself, you're not going to survive long. So communities are made up of all sorts of different interactions and dynamics, and it's an amazing thing to watch and just sit and look at how things interact and behave with each other. So that is part of community ecology, is studying how these interactions work, and if I impact one species, how does that influence the other species? There's a thing called the ripple effect, that if you mess with one species, it not only impacts that species, but it ripples out to all the other species that are connected to it within the ecological food web that we see in communities. So we want to keep that in mind with community ecology. Okay, so now that we've looked at the interactions and the dynamics within communities, we want to look at how communities change. And this is what we call succession. So succession is known as the developmental change in a community over time. So communities are not stable. They're not static. There's constant change and succession happening. So our little snapshot here. Here's a mangrove seedling. That seedling drifts around, gets into shallow water, puts its roots down, and starts to grow. It's a producer. It's going to live in the ocean, shallow waters, usually along coastal shorelines or any shallow, relatively shallow area of the ocean. The prop roots produced by the mangroves will slow water down. And as the water current slows down, the sediment accumulates around the prop roots. They're deciduous trees. The leaves fall off every year. They rot, they decompose. That puts nutrients into the area of the roots. Those nutrients start to accumulate. Decomposers, detritivores can feed off those nutrients. Water current is slowed down. Snails can now start to live there. Other invertebrates, insects. Oh, now there's a food source. Now you get other things coming into the mangroves. So what mangroves do is they actually establish islands in the Caribbean, all over the world. But they build these islands over time. And as they keep building these islands, they're changing the ecosystem. They're changing the community. They're changing the water temperature. They're changing the water velocity, the wave action, the sediment load, the nutrients, the amount of sunlight. They are establishing the community and helping the community go through this process of change. So this is the idea of succession. So what we'll look at in the next lecture is how does succession start, and then the steps it takes as it goes through the process. And is it ever finished? Will community ever reach the end of succession?